Hey everyone, welcome to the very first video, very first section in Tailwind CSS version 3.
If you're new here, make sure you leave a like, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon. This is free of cost and helps the channel grow.
Things which I want to discuss in this video is just the basics of what we are doing in this course, what Tailwind is, what we'll be doing, and how you can practice using codedamm's playground interface. So Tailwind is an interesting framework for CSS which allows you to pack your UI and your styling of the UI into the HTML itself, right? So the traditional way of working with CSS is something like you give it a class of hello, let's say, and then you go to your CSS file. Let's say you create one, style.css. You create a file and then you say hello, and then you give it a background of yellow, something like that. You go back to the HTML, you link the CSS, like link, let's see, link rel style sheet href style.css, and then your styles automatically start reflecting once you put in some content over here, as you can see. So this way is fine, but what Tailwind allows you to do is that it restricts your ability in a way to use certain number of styles only. Now what do I mean by that? And this is also not fully true statement, but let's say I wanted to create a nice looking button over here which says something like click me. Now I could have any amount of pixel padding here, which is like if I say display inline block, I could have any amount of pixel padding, for example padding 5 pixel, right? I could have any amount of margin 2 pixel or 20 pixel. I could have any sort of color in the whole spectrum of colors of RGB and web supported colors, which is, to be honest, a huge choice to pick from. And I could have any text color. Now in theory this sounds awesome and this sounds wonderful, but in practice when you're doing styling like this, it becomes very tiresome to actually build a UI system yourself, where the margins are pretty much standardized, the paddings are standardized, the colors are standardized, the color palette is there, and so on. So more than anything, Tailwind does two things for me which I personally like a lot about, and if you go to the source code of codedammn, you would pretty much see Tailwind being used all the way. This page is not rendered on server side, but if you go to a page like this, you're gonna see on codedammn we pretty much use Tailwind in a lot of places. Flex, px2, you can see it's Tailwind all the way, right? So one of the things which I like a lot about Tailwind are these two things, the most important things. The first is that you can cut this UI and paste it in some other project which is also using Tailwind, or some other page which has Tailwind enabled, and you don't have to include style sheets and everything over there, because this is like a complete widget in itself. And second of all, it binds you in certain best practices with CSS itself. That is, what should your margin values ideally be? What are your colors which you should be using in your project or which you should be using in your site, and so on. So these abstractions and these value binding plus the ability to get out of these bindings, that is also Tailwind provides, so that's completely fine. This is super important stuff and super awesome of Tailwind as a framework, because I'm not a UI person. I don't like to work with UIs as a developer. I can rely on Tailwind's measurements and units and ability to create nice UIs. So this is why I believe Tailwind is an important library for you to learn only if you like it, because it will boost your productivity a lot. That is all for this video. In the next one, in the next interactive videos and labs which we have in this course, we're going to be discussing a lot of new features of Tailwind 3, as well as the fundamentals, the core understanding of Tailwind as well. Hey everyone, welcome back. And in this video, we'll be discussing about how you can get started with Tailwind CSS. And this course in general would also be divided into two parts. The first part is where we are actually learning about Tailwind in HTML world. And the second part will be where we will look at the Tailwind configuration. And we'll also tap into React in that, section or in that particular video. So right now I'm going to stick with the basic HTML, CSS, JavaScript playground, which we have just to keep things simple. And I'm going to include a Tailwind CSS JIT compiler, which I'll tell you in a moment what that is. And we're going to be learning all about Tailwind using this interface, right? And then further down the line in the course, we'll actually see how to use Tailwind properly with React, because React is the technology which we are learning inside of this full stack or front end or whatever learning path you are enrolled right now. So let's go ahead and take a look at how the new Tailwind CSS you can use in your basic HTML project. So in order to do that, what you have to do is all the stuff we'll do when we are working with React. But for now, we're going to be going all the way down, and I'm going to be going to this place CDN link, and I'm going to be adding this script tag called this script src cdn.tailwindcss.com, right? And I'm just gonna make some space over here and also remove the style sheet because we're not going to need that. And let's just get rid of these few meta tags as well, because we are not like shipping any website or anything. So there we are. Now Tailwind is pretty much available to us right away. What this script tag does is if you open this, you're going to see that it redirects you to cdn.tailwindcss.com/version3. Now, you might be thinking that if Tailwind comes with all the pre-built classes and, the things which I mentioned, all the restrictions, then why is it loading a JavaScript bundle instead of CSS? Well, up till Tailwind 2, there was nothing known as JIT compiler. And what a JIT compiler is, it stands for just in time compiler. This just in time means that Tailwind is actually generating your styles just in time. That means as you're writing it, Tailwind is generating those styles in memory. Now, this is important because with CSS, obviously, even if you restrict it, even if I restrict it to 10 margin classes, let's say if I have margin 1 to margin 10, right? And then if I have something like padding 1 to padding 10. So you can see over right here, I have padding at x-axis, padding at y-axis. I would have padding at, maybe both axes and so on. So this would pretty much start to get a lot heavy very soon. And this is one of the problems which Tailwind 2 faced as well, which led to the just-in-time compiler mode. That is, the bundle size of Tailwind in the developer environment was so huge, was probably in megabytes, that it was no longer a viable option to, just keep on loading the whole bundle, whole CSS bundle every single time. In some cases, it was also approaching the browser limits of how much CSS the browser can handle. So something else needed to be done. So what the smart people at Tailwind did is they come up with a just-in-time compiler, which pretty much allows you to write all the CSS which you want of Tailwind, but it will parse that on the runtime and it will just create styles for those particular classes which you are using instead of just loading all the bundles. So this is why this is a script tag and not a JS and not a CSS bundle. Okay, so how do we verify if this is working or not? So let's verify it with a very simple, let's say h1 tag. I'm going to say my name is Mehul and you are watching this on codedamn, or rather I should say watching plus practicing, right? Because you know why. So if I go ahead and give it a class of bg gray 800, you're gonna see something nice happened. Automatically the background is very dark and it is a shade of a gray, but the text is not visible. So I'm gonna give it a text of white as well. So you see it's almost like intuitive. If you read it, it says like background gray of 800. 800 is the intensity of the color. So if you can guess, Less intense color would probably be like something like 400 or 300. What you have to realize is that when we talk about intensity of the stuff in Tailwind, it's always in the multiple of 100 except for 50. So there is a shade available of BG gray 50, which is a very, very light gray. I'm not even sure if that is visible in the video, but if it is, I mean, I'm saying the truth. There is a color of BG gray 50. There would not be a color of BG gray 49 or anything. This will just probably not render anything at all because, you know, it's just CSS not found. But 50 is there, 100 is there, then 200 is there, 300 is there, and so on. So as you move above, this color gets a bit stronger and stronger, right? So it just keeps getting stronger. At a point, because you have text white over here, it's advisable to give it something like 700 or 800. Right, so these are the classes, and the good thing about this is if I give it a padding of, let's say, 2, and I'm going to come to these units as well, a margin of, let's say, 4. Now the block which we have created over here, and let's say if I also give it a shadow, and bear with me over here, it'll just become a little bit easier in no time. Now, the good thing about this h1 tag, or a nice thing about this h1 tag, is that this tag would always render this particular layout, and all I have to do is cut and paste this in any place, in any environment where Tailwind is running, right? So this is the awesome thing about Tailwind, that you pretty much have you know, an independence from importing all the CSS styles and stuff like that. So this is one of the aspects which I like a lot. So yep, let's keep this video to this because we have done enough. We have imported Tailwind's JIT compiler. We have understood why JIT is needed. We have done a bit of hello world kind of stuff with Tailwind as well. And we have done the hello world thing. So yeah, that's the most important part of starting something new. Hey everyone, welcome back. And in this video, let's just go ahead and try to understand what exactly is this 2 and 4 and all this stuff which is going on. I'm going to head back to the Tailwind documentation, and this is like one place where you should be spending a lot of time as a developer, not just in Tailwind, rather I think in pretty much anything which is like the official docs, and especially with a library like Tailwind which has a very nice interface and a lot of things documented. It's always a good idea. But anyway, if we go to something like, let's see, if we search for padding over here, you're gonna see we have all these units over here. Now you can see that Tailwind does not has a continuous limit, a continuous unit, as in you can create a 0.75 rem in Tailwind utility, but you cannot create a 0.76 rem. Right? So when I say that Tailwind restricts you in a way where it would not give you pretty much all the things to do, this is what I mean, right? You cannot just blow up your design by having a left and right width padding of 0.75 and then top and bottom of a weird 0.76, you know, something like that, which does not seem normal. But you can see all of these units, these are like class names on the left. All of these class names actually have a corresponding rem unit, not a pixel one. There were a couple of pixel units at the top if you took a look, that is padding right pixel, padding top pixel, padding y pixel, and so on. But all the other things are not in pixel. Similarly, for margin, you will find similar units, and you know, for space between and all the other utilities which involve any sort of padding or margin or any sort of unit, you're going to see that they do not include pixel. Instead, they include rem. Now, there's an important reason for that. Let's say if I start with this example itself. If I tell you to read this example, how would you read it? Background of gray, text of white, padding of 2. This means padding 2 pretty much everywhere on the side. Let's say if I wanted to have a padding of 10 only on the x-axis and nothing on the y-axis, you can see it reflects. And then on the y-axis, let's say if I wanted to have a 24, which is like a huge padding, but sometimes you will see that 25 would not work, right? Why? Because 25 is not a class. So for that, you would have to check either in the documentation or if you're working locally on VS Code, your IDE should also give you hints. We are in the process of adding the auto completion and IDE part of Tailwind in the playground. So if for some reason you think that your style is not working, make sure to double check whether that style even exists in Tailwind or not. So you can see over here, after 24, you're going to see there's a direct jump to 28, right? So the values are also continuous initially, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then they also have gaps, right? So this is something you have to remember when you're using Tailwind, that sometimes if the class is not reflecting, it is possible that you have written the wrong style. So I'm going to go back to 24, and you can see we have a nice little div, and this margin over here also follows the similar format of margin X and then margin Y of, let's say, 10, and you're going to see it gives me 10 units of margin on the Y part and 4 units of margin on the X part, that is the X axis. Or if I have a similar value, I could just drop X and Y and directly use this. Alright, that is fine, but the question still remains, why do we have rems in Tailwind and not pixel? Now the reason for this is because rems are more customizable than pixel. One rem, essentially one unit over here, if this is 1, then that is 16 pixels by default in pretty much every screen. So you see, when you have a padding of 1 rem, you actually are doing 16 pixels of padding. So if I go ahead and actually take a look at this H1 over here, and if I shift to computed, which actually shows us what the real CSS is being applied, real CSS, right? Not the fancy stuff which Tailwind is doing. This is the real CSS which is being applied to the element. You can see we gave it a padding X of 10, which means padding left and right of 10 units. 10 units, according to the documentation over here, means that the padding is 2.5 rems, and 2.5 rems should technically be equal to 40 pixels of padding. So if I go back and if I check out padding left and right, you can see it's 40 pixels. It's in the computer tab. That means this is what is being applied. Now here's the fun part with rems. The fun part is if I go to the HTML tag at top and if I change the font size of HTML tag from 16 pixel to, let's say, 18 pixel, you can see every single thing on the page which was using a rem automatically got adjusted. If I go back to this computed, you're going to see the padding left and right became 14 pixel. Why? Because the calculation now is not happening on 16, it's happening on 18, which is the base size of the page. Now let me tell you that most systems always have 16 pixels as the default value, so you don't have to worry about it. But you remember, or if you have ever seen, that you can go to the browser settings and toggle that area where it says I'm not able to read font at 16 pixels, so let me just increase it a little bit. So you have those sliders for people who want to see things a little bit bigger on their phones or on their screens. That is where the browser would start injecting this particular thing. And this is, if for example somebody wants to have a 24 pixel kind of thing, it will automatically adjust according to their preference in their whatever setting they have chosen. Again, let me remind you that probably 95% of the world does not keep it at 24. They will keep it at 16 only. But for some people who want to do that, still your website would look awesome. On the other hand, if you were using pixels, then padding, or not font size actually, if you were using padding left and right of 16 and padding right of 16 as well, this would actually not reflect properly, right? This would actually break in a way where I think in this case it would not really matter as much because H1 is a block element, but still in case of margin you will see the difference, where if I change this margin left and right to different values, you're going to see that the margin and padding, everything would remain same and your site would not scale properly. So this is why Tailwind uses rem as a choice. And this is why you don't really have to worry a lot about rem and pixel. And to be honest, I did this video, I wanted to convey this concept because sometimes you might be confused what is the significance of this unit and everything. So the significance of this unit in itself is that 4 of these units is actually 1 rem, right? So it's 4 is 1 rem. So it's basically like saying every 1 increment is an increase of 0.25 rem, which in itself is something like 0.25 times 16, which is 4 pixels, right? So kind of, if you want to think about this in an intuitive way, when you go from 1 to 2, you're actually increasing 4 pixels, then 3, 4 pixels, then 4, 4 pixels, and so on, right? If you wanted to think about that in that way. Hey everyone, welcome back. And in this video, before we get into all the Tailwind CSS styling and shadows and this and that, what I want to discuss about is a fundamental way Tailwind works with responsive design and with devices of different widths, and that is using these classes. Now, in Tailwind, what you have to understand is that a lot of metadata to the existing classes is attached using colon, right? So let's take a look at these set of classes. This set of class say that SM, MD, large, extra large, and 2 times extra large have these particular breakpoints as the, a minimum width, which is important. And what this means is that if I am in this particular class, and if I say that, hey, this SM should be BG gray 700, which means anything above 640 pixel should have this style applied, right? If the screen size is above 640 pixels, then only the style should be applied. And this could be visually seen as I drag this, and if I make this above 640, you can see the moment my screen goes above 640 pixel, we get the gray, and the moment it goes down 640 pixel, we pretty much lose the gray because it is lost, right? I mean, this becomes white. If I give this a background of, let's say, BG yellow 900, like this, you can see this is yellow right now as long as it is, under 640 pixel width. And the moment I cross that, you can see it becomes gray. Now this is like a media query, and this is in fact a media query under the hood, which says that anything which is minimum width of 640 should have this particular style, right? And in this case, it doesn't matter the order in which you can put it above as well, because media queries have a higher specificity than a single style. So you can see this would still work. But this is important because using these selectors, using these SM, MD, LG, XL, 2XL, you can customize the behavior of your website, right? So you don't have to write explicit media queries in CSS. You can just write the behavior over here and be done with it. For example, one quick example I can also show you is something like SM, and then you can say text 2XL, right? So you can see that if I increase the size of this div, the text automatically increases because the text is set to 2XL. If I change this to 4XL, for example, you're going to see it becomes much larger the moment we cross that small boundary, right? So you can see you can play around with a lot of styles in Tailwind using these selectors. And the good thing about them is that there is no limit pretty much to whatever you enter here. So for example, if you enter a background as a normal class, you can also enter that as a background in SM or MD or XL or extra large or anything, right? So you can pretty much apply all the styles, whatever you want, with these responsive selectors as well, and that'll just work out of the box. And this is like most common with layouts and sometimes with font sizes as well, and with paddings as well. A lot of times less common with colors and stuff, because ideally you would not switch colors based on the layout. But yeah, I mean, that's something you can do. Hey everyone, welcome back, and in this video let's just go ahead and take out some time to discuss about all the colors which are available in Tailwind and how you can set them as background or text colors, right? So I'm going to get rid of the responsive styles for now so that we can focus more on the colors part. So if I go ahead and take a look at this colors section in the, let's see, there should be a dedicated section for colors, I think, inside theme, inside colors. There we go. So you can see that Tailwind by default, and because we are using JIT, we get this complete color palette right out of the box, right? So you can see we have slate color, we have gray, zinc, neutral, all these colors, and we have, like I mentioned earlier in the, I think in the introduction video, we have a very light shade in terms of 50. Then after that, it just increments from 100 in terms of 100, right? 100, 200, 300, all the way up to 900. So one of the best things about Tailwind is that it also gives you a nice color palette, which are carefully chosen colors with nice, color theme and nice background contrast with the text colors as well. Obviously, you can add custom colors. We're going to learn about Tailwind configuration later down the line. But for now, the way this works is that you pick up whatever the color you want. For example, in this case, let's pick up this keyword, which I don't know how to pronounce, but looks awesome. So I'm going to paste this over here, lowercase, and I'm going to add an intensity of that particular color, right? In this case, I just chose 900. You could have pretty much chosen 800, 700, and it will work out of the box. Similarly, for text, you can see that white works out of the box because Tailwind just provides that, although you can see that white isn't like really written anywhere, but that still works. But in general, you can play with the gray or the slate variants as well. Text gray wouldn't work. What you have to do is text gray and then an intensity of that as well. So in this case, this is just a little bit gray, so that's why it appears almost like white. This is like even more closer to white, but this over here is pretty much a solid dark gray, right? So you can play with these colors in terms of background and text colors. You can also give background gradients as a color, which is like a really cool and interesting thing you can do with Tailwind. Although I would admit it's not like completely customizable and controllable. If you want anything which is more customizable, you would have to go into CSS files. But here's how the background gradient part works. So for the gradient color, what we can do is say BG gradient to right, which means it should start the gradient from left and to right. And that is also clear in what we're about to write. And then you have to say from the color and the intensity, whatever that color is. So you can see that already the gradient is working just fine. It fades into the transparent color, but that's usually not what we want. If we are creating a gradient, it should probably go all the way. So I can say something like 2 blue 600, right? So blue and cyan is basically, a little bit on the similar side. So it forms a nice gradient over here. Similarly, you can have gradients not only just between different colors but between same colors as well. So if you do something like this also creates a gradient in terms of just increasing the intensity. So that is also awesome. And what you can do, this is pretty much all you can get in terms of the gradient stops. This is like a 50% kind of 50% in between transition. You can also specify via and then cyan, let's say 400. So what you have the option over here in terms of customizing the gradient is specifying either 2 stops or 3 stops and the colors, which is from the Tailwind color palette, right? So this is pretty much it in terms of what you can achieve with gradients, which is also pretty awesome, right? If you just want to create a nice looking gradient. In fact, if you go to codedamm's website, you're going to see at the home page, this gradient, this is actually a gradient which we have in the background, right? This particular thing. Hey everyone, welcome back. And in this video, let's look at hover classes in Tailwind as well, because hover is also one of a common action, especially on desktops where you have a mouse pointer. So Tailwind makes it easier to customize your styles based on hovering as well. So instead of writing CSS for this, we have inbuilt support for Tailwind. And just like you would do it with a responsive breakdown, you would do the similar thing in Tailwind with a hover and then a column. And then whatever style you write over here would reflect whenever you are hovering. So if I have text gray 900 and a BG hover, remember that you have to write hover multiple times, BG gray 200. If I do something like this, then when I hover over this, you can see the text turns gray, but the background does not turn gray because you can see we have a gradient. So that might be taking a bit of more specificity. So I can probably give it BG cyan 900, something like that. So now if I hover over this, you can see the text turns black and the background turns gray, right? So this is how you would work with hover in general. Nothing fancy, nothing complicated. You just specify the styles which you want and they will start working the moment you pretty much hover on any other element. Hey everyone, welcome back. And in this video, we'll be discussing about how to build Flexbox layouts in Tailwind. And this goes without saying that we would not be discussing Flexbox in general, but only about using Flexbox because we have already done that in the CSS course. So if you're not following the full stack or the front end learning path on codedamn, it is high time that you do, because that is a path, that is a structure in which you will be following, or becoming a full stack or a front end developer. But anyway, let's start with the Flexbox in CSS. And just like other classes, it's pretty simple to use Flexbox with Tailwind because they provide out of the box classes and out of the box utilities for most common things. So let's just go ahead and start developing a very simple layout. So I'm going to say something like, let's say this is a div and I have another 3 divs inside this, right? What I can do is at the same time, I can give them all a width, or let's say a height of 10, something like that, with a background color of gray 800. This could be blue, this could be red, something like that, right? And on the top, I could start giving this some flex input, right? So right away, you can see that the moment I give it flex, everything just disappears because these do not have widths with them. Now with flex, what happens is that if I go ahead and let me just refresh this. If I go ahead and open this, you're going to see that this flex class actually just says display flex and nothing more. So what we want is that every single one of them to be equal width by saying flex1. Now what does this mean in real world CSS is if you go ahead and take a look at flex1, it gives you a flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis of 0. So just a quick revision with Flexbox, flex grow 1 and flex shrink 1 means that you should try to take as much space as you can, and flex basis is basically a kind of like a width equivalent in Flexbox, and giving it a 0% just means that you fall back to flex grow and shrink. So this gives you a nice little layout. You can see I can also go ahead and increase this, let's say a little bit, only if this is available. Yep, or maybe we can use the highest one, which I think is 96. And you can see now that we have a nice little layout. Now, a nice thing which we can do in order to combine this with a responsive based layout is I can say that, hey, whenever this is by default, this is flex column, but nope, not flex column, actually flex row. That is the default flex behavior. But whenever I am on a larger screen, for anything which is smaller, it should be flex column. And in this case, you can see because we don't have a definitive width, I can also go ahead and do something like on SM, this is flex 1, but otherwise it just takes the full width as a block element. Alright, so what's happening over here? You can see the moment I cross that small barrier, the moment I cross that, all of them get this class removed, or not exactly removed, but the effect of this class gone. So this is why you get a flex call. I mean, this is basically, in a stack, in a vertical stack. The moment we grow over this class takes over, and then this renders in a row, right? So if you know how Flexbox operates, this would be useful for triggering mobile based layouts, right? Whenever size goes below 640 pixels. So yep, this is like pretty much how you can work with Flexbox. There are a bunch of utilities: Flex None, Flex Auto, Flex One. On hover, you can also kind of like modify the style and the bit of functionality. But for the most part, you probably would see yourself working with this flex property, flex call, flex row property, and the modifiers associated with them. Flex one, something like, you can also do something like, if we go to this area and get rid of this, then I can say something like flex grow, and then I can say to this, for example, something like width 24, and then this could be width 24 as well, right? So now you can see that this one takes all the available width, and these ones are 24 units of width in this case, right? So you can play around with this, and it's easy to build such layouts. You can see this works just fine. But yeah, that's pretty much it, how you can get started with Flexbox and with Flex in general with Tailwind. All you have to do is understand which class is doing what sort of trigger. So Flex triggers display flex, Flex calls trigger the direction. Then with responsiveness combined, you can change the direction. Then Flex grow, Flex shrink, Flex one, all sorts of things can help you trigger various kinds of layout in your file without even changing any sort of external CSS or anything. Hey everyone, welcome back, and in this video let's just go ahead and take a look at grid as well with Tailwind, how you can work with grids. And grid is also a great way to build UIs, especially two-dimensional UIs where you want, a lot of customization and control over a grid sort of formation instead of just the Flexbox, which allows you to either work horizontally or vertically. So in this case, we're going to start off with a very simple example where we could probably create something like this only. So I'm going to start off with the same thing, but let's say if I give each of them a dimension of 20 as well, get rid of the flex grow thing. So we can go ahead and do something like this. And over here, instead of flex, I'm going to change this to grid. Now this allows us to use all the properties which we have, right? So in this case, you can see I can use grid columns 4, which means that this should be organized in columns of 4. So if we have like a bunch of more such elements, right? I can say grid calls 4 or 3 in this case, and you can see they equally line up in 3 different grids, right? And I could just probably say this as W full instead of restricting the width, and you're going to see that it combines. And of course this is not visible right now, so what we can say is gap of 1, which is like a grid property which allows you to give a little bit of gap between all these elements. Similarly, you can play around with other properties of column start, template start, row start, and row end. So for example, in case of call start or call span, I can go to a particular grid and give it a property of, let's say, this one right here as call span of 2, and get rid of this one over here. So you can see that the second one now spans 2 columns. So you can play around with more properties of grid by looking at the documentation and whatever your layouts demand you to do. But it's basically CSS, right? You can see the equivalent CSS as well over here. Sometimes the CSS might be a little bit more complex in a way because Tailwind might be using variables and all sorts of stuff in the CSS. But if you understand the premise of what Tailwind is doing, it's easier to build complex layouts over here as well. So you see it has pretty much support for all the grid properties which we have learned in the CSS module in the CSS section. And it also has property support for Flexbox, which we also looked at in a couple of videos before. But I think we skipped over the justify content items and this sort of stuff, which is also like pretty basic and one of the few things which we discuss like almost immediately once we start working with Flexbox. So I hope that you remember the justify content and left and right and center and all that stuff from the CSS module. If you do not, then go back into your full stack learning path or front end learning path and take a look. And these properties basically just plug and play and allows you to write those particular styles. So yep, that's pretty much it for grid as well in Tailwind. In the coming videos, when we'll build some apps or something with the Tailwind CSS, we're going to be using a lot of this stuff. So make sure you keep an eye out on not only just this course, but in other courses ahead where we would use Tailwind to build stuff. Hey everyone, welcome back. And in this video, we're going to be taking a look at how to build a simple sort of carousel in CSS with Tailwind, which is not exactly a carousel because it will lack controls and stuff because we need JS for that, but mostly a nice widget which will snap itself in place just like this particular widget does when I release the scroll, right? And this is because of the new addition of scroll snapping feature in Tailwind, not in CSS. It has been available for CSS for a while, but this scroll snap align, which is possible now inside of Tailwind, is available in version 3. Let's take a look at how we can build this particular app right here. You can see when I leave my mouse, it snaps itself to the center, not exactly center, to the start, because that's what the snap says. But let's see how we can build it with a couple of divs over here. So I'm going to get rid of this code right here. We're going to start a little bit fresh. I'm going to start off with something like, for example, let's build up a few divs. So I'm going to say something like width of 100. Hopefully that is available. Height of, let's say 48. Then a BG gray 800, something like that. Right, and it looks like it's just way too big, so probably something like, or maybe it's not available. That's a more plausible explanation. Yep. All right, so we have the first div. We're gonna do a bunch of divs with different colors: green, red, blue, yellow. Right, and I'm gonna give this upper div a class of flex. So what this means is that this is now a flexbox, and you can see that obviously it does not follow our widths set in Flexbox, right? So what I can say is something like overflow x auto, which just means that, hey, you're allowed to scroll out of the original width of your container. And finally, to allow this element to actually use its own width instead of just shrinking to fit, what I can say is flex shrink 0, right? So the moment I say that, you can see now this area is scrollable instead of, you know, just getting shrink down to the individual widths. Awesome. So now, right now you can see in terms of scrollable, this does not do much except for scrolling. So in order to add those snap possibilities, what we can do is give it a direction first of all. So I'm going to snap this into X direction by saying that, right? So this sets certain properties which are required for enabling the scroll snap in CSS. But you're going to see that it still does not work because you have to give where that particular element should snap on an individual level. So in this case, let's say if I give it a snap of center, you can see now if I go ahead and try to scroll, this green over here snaps at center, right? When I scroll and I leave my mouse. Similarly, this red over here snaps at center as well. Similarly for blue and similarly for the last one, yellow. If I change the direction from snap center to snap start, you're going to see it starts to snap at the start. Similarly for green, you can see it snaps at start and so on. So if you give it something like space x of 4, for example, you can see now it is like much nicer in terms of visibility. And even if you give it a nice scroll thing, you're going to see it always lands in the in the starting part of the particular div, right? So that's awesome. You can also add a margin, a scroll margin to it. So you can see the scroll ML6 creates a left margin of 6 units. So if I go ahead and give this to all of the divs over here, you're going to see that now they pretty much have a 6 units of snap margin to themselves. And if I match this with the SpaceX, that is the padding, this would pretty much mean that, it'll just keep that area to itself and it'll snap to the white area instead of the actual boundary of the element. So yep, that's pretty much it for scrolling in CSS with Tailwind, scrolling and snapping the scroll. So pretty exciting, pretty neat feature of Tailwind version 3. Hey everyone, welcome back. And in this video, let's just go ahead and discuss about the CSS typography with Tailwind, which is also an important thing because most of the part of a website is actually text. So let's start with the regular H1 tag over here. And if you have not observed it yet, when you include Tailwind, you're going to see that you automatically lose the ability of nice font sizes, which the browser provides, which is not exactly very nice. But you can see here H1, H2, H3 all are of same font size and same font weight and so on. So the reason for this is because Tailwind wants you to explicitly style them according to your layouts or whatever your need is, and it provides you with a rich set of classes to do that. So font family, starting with font family, I'm just going to cover a few important ones. You can see that you can specify a particular font directly with whatever is available inside of Tailwind, and of course you can add more fonts later down the line as well with configuration, which we'll talk about a bit later in the advanced section. But mostly you would not be setting or hovering, changing fonts on hovering, right? Fonts once set for a website is usually set. So we're going to be moving on to font size, which is super important, and this is what you will be using all the time. So you can see that Tailwind gives you the variants from extra small all the way up to 9XL, which is 8 rems, so 0.75 rems to 8 rems, right, which is the default system. So usually you would obviously have something like text 4XL for a heading, then maybe text 3XL for an H2 and so on, right? But it's up to you. So let's start with a single H1. Let's say the quick brown fox sentence, whatever that is, because it includes all the alphabets, but I don't know the exact sentence. So specifying a text font size actually increases the size of the thing, which is awesome, right? You need that. The font style is something like you can set it to italic or not italic, depending on what you want. Again, just you have to write a single keyword. Font weight allows you to set a weight. That means how thick the font should be. So you can see the equivalence of this is actually in the font weight of CSS. And this would only work well if you have imported the correct fonts with the correct weights. Most of the fonts sometimes don't have all the variants, so the browser somehow just tries to make up for that. So make sure, if you are looking at custom fonts, make sure you have imported the correct weights of the font. So for example, take a look here. If I do font extra light over here, you're going to see that this is much more thin compared to what the default was, right? And if I say font extra bold, this becomes much more thicker than what it was, right? So depending on what kind of heading you have, you might want extra bold at some places and extra light at other places. So again, this is something you can pick up with the help of Tailwind. Then of course you have basic utilities like text aligning as center. So if you give a text center to this, it will center your text instead of just writing another part of CSS manually. So that all sorts of alignments and stuff is there. But text color, you can see that it specifies text white and all the colors which you have already seen in the current color palette. So that is awesome. So you can just pick up any sort of style and you're going to see the moment you apply it, it turns the style into that color. Similarly, if we move over to text decoration, you're going to see this kind of is a new feature, how you customize the text decoration color in Tailwind CSS 3. So if I just copy, let's say this one over here and paste it right here, you see it'll underline it, and let me just give this a gray of 800. It'll underline it, and it'll underline it nicely, right? You can see the cues in the sentence don't get cut off, so that's that looks good. And on top of this, you can also specify the style of the decoration. So you can see you have a bunch of styles. You can have a double decoration, you can have a solid decoration which is the default style. If you opt in into double, you can see you get something like this. You can also have a wavy style, which is, something like if you want to show a grammatical mistake or a sentence, something like that, you can do that. That's also pretty awesome. You can have a dashed decoration, dotted decoration, and so on. So it's almost like whatever you can do with a border kind of thing, you can do over here. And similarly, this can be applied on hover. So that's pretty awesome as well. So if I hover over this, you can see it changes its style. So that's awesome. So these utilities over here is pretty much a lot of what you would need along the way. The font size, the type, the decoration, the colors, the alignment, the thickness, and basically how you want it to present can be done with all of these utilities in Tailwind CSS. I'm going to keep this video short and until this point only. Hey everyone, welcome back, and in this video let's talk about shadows in Tailwind, which was being awaited for a long time, and finally the support for shadows is here, and the color shadows I should mean, because the regular shadow, which was just that black shadow, was already there, but now you can have colored shadows with Tailwind, and this is awesome. So let's try to create a button like this in our codedamn playground over here. So I'm going to go ahead and write something like, this is the best programming website, you should get a pro account, right? And it seems like it's just too much text, but that's fine. So I'm gonna go ahead and now create a button which would say subscribe via Stripe, something like that, and this would be our subscription button. But right now you can see that it does not look very fancy, so we're gonna start building this button over here. So I'm going to walk you through with the example of how it is done on the main site, on the Tailwind site. So it's gonna need a little bit of padding on the x-axis and on the y-axis. So you can see we have given it, roughly like 12 pixel, assuming that my device is working perfectly fine. So it's 12 pixel padding on the x direction and 8 pixel on the y direction, or rather we should just say 3 units and 2 units. Then we have to give it a background color as well. Let's give it an indigo as the color, and BG indigo 500. That's the opacity. We need the text to be white, and we need a little bit of border around this as well, border radius, right? Which is what we call in CSS. In Tailwind, it is just called rounded, right? And rounded can give your borders a little bit of rounded, but you can also increase the intensity of rounded by having a dash and then LG or MD or SM, these sort of modifiers, which you also see in the responsiveness view, right? Then we would do something like shadow. So when I say shadow, it'll automatically create a shadow which might not be just visible just yet. So I can just give it a shadow of large. You can see now the shadow appears a bit, but that was it. Earlier in the Tailwind earlier versions, that was the only thing you could do. But now, let me just center this first. But now you can, let's just give it a margin top of 8 or 12 so that we have a little bit of gap. But now you can, in Tailwind CSS 3, also give color of the shadow. So the way you do that is you just say shadow, then the color, in this case indigo, and then the intensity of that color, right? So you can see it's 500 right now, but it appears like it's too thick of a color. So in order to control the opacity, you have to give it a slash and then the percentage of opacity. So let's say I just want 90% opacity. right? So this is like 90% of the original shadow. If I give it 10, then this is like 10% of the original shadow, which is pretty much like non-existent. So let's just give it close to like 50%. And this will give a nice shadow effect. What you can also do is on hover, let's say you want the shadow to become a bit more intense at 80% opacity. So when I hover over this, you can see the shadow increases, which is pretty awesome. Now just to complete the demo, you can also play around with the font size and font semi-bold, just to give it a little bit of bold area, bold text, and you have got a nice stripe button, subscribe via stripe. And obviously this is something which you can copy paste anywhere on your website, and this button would render exactly like this as long as you're using Tailwind. So this is the magic of shadows and Tailwind in general. Pretty awesome if you ask me. And now, you know, this shadow could look pretty amazing on different sort of backgrounds as well. So if you have a dark background on the body, you can see that you can have a nice little text gray of 100 as a text color and a nice stripe button over here, right? So yep, that's pretty much it, how you can create shadows in Tailwind CSS and how you work with a lot of this stuff, a lot of buttons and a lot of classes. I think we have done this for the first time in having so many classes on a single element, but that's, you get used to that stuff. Hey everyone, welcome back, and in this video let's just go ahead and discuss about functionality in Tailwind CSS, which was only possible because of just-in-time compiler introduced in the last version, and now it seems like a no-brainer a lot of times when you want to opt out of the default styling mechanisms. So what dynamic styling with Tailwind means is that instead of sometimes what happens is that your default styles which Tailwind provides are not enough, right? Whether that's maybe a 1 pixel margin which you wanted to give, or a custom font size, or a custom color, or something which you wanted to give which is not available, and you don't want to go into your CSS files or mess around with that. What you can do is instead use these placeholders with properties. That is like one way to go about. So if I give something like 200 pixel, and remember that I'm doing this inside these square brackets, what Tailwind would do is that it will try to infer what the property did earlier. For example, this property did margin top, and there used to be the value for this particular property, right? So instead of the value, it found that, hey, I have this weird square syntax. So this means that this is a dynamic property. This means whatever the value is inside this is actually the style which should be generated. So if you open this in a new tab, and if you take a look under the hood, you're going to see the style which is generated, the class name which is generated over here is a dynamic class of .margin top of 200 pixel, the same class which you used, but the style is pretty much the same thing which you would expect it to be, right? Similarly, you can have 3em, for example. Doesn't matter what you want. And refresh, you're going to see it's going to generate the same class as your class name, but it's going to dynamically populate that particular style. So this is pretty awesome. Why? Because it allows you to opt out of Tailwind's default boundaries. Although it should not be used pretty much with every single style, because then what's the point of using Tailwind? But sometimes it's a great escape hatch, right? For example, I want to give a custom color to body. So instead of going all the way, to config files or to CSS to add it, what I can do is something like this, where I just specify, or I think I don't know, a black color. I think FT was the one. Yeah, not sure. So for example, let's just have a background of black or something like which is a little bit nicer or a little bit less black, 3E. So I can have a 3E as a dynamic background color, and this will just work out of the box. So I don't have to add it as a new color or mess around with my CSS and so on. Similarly, for text, I can have a 72 pixel as a size and it will just work out of the box. But like I say, it's more of a replacement of a existing value, and Tailwind would understand it out of the box. So this is pretty awesome and pretty amazing, which escape hatch, which allows you to work with all sorts of values within your Tailwind. So this is one way of having a property which Tailwind already knows and assigning it a custom value. In Tailwind CSS 3, there is another way of having completely dynamic property and value assigned to your div element or whatever element. So you can see in the dynamic section of the Tailwind docs, it actually says that you can pretty much throw in a full utility, the full property and the value pair, and it will just make it work, right? So if you want to try it out, what we can do is something like background and then the same color, just like that, and it should still work. And yep, it does work. So this is pretty awesome, right? You can have a black background over here. So at this point, you are literally just writing CSS, but in a way which is combined with Tailwind, right? So you can have background black and then display flex, something like that, and it will just work out of the box. So not display flex, I think that won't be visible very much. Opacity 0.5, and then what I can say on hover, opacity is 1. So again, this is like an escape hatch which works pretty awesome, but you should probably not use it because Tailwind also already has support for opacity and opacity 100 like this. So try to not use the escape hatches if they are not required. BG Gray 900 would be a good option as well. So yep, I mean, but in case you wanted to do that, just letting you know that this is completely fair, completely possible, and completely valid in Tailwind CSS version 3. Hey everyone, welcome back. And in this video, I want to show you how you can use Tailwind CSS with React. And that is pretty much what you would be doing in this learning path all along, because we have chosen React as a technology. So in order to use Tailwind with React, you have to set it up according to what your environment is. For example, if I have React Playground on codedamn, at least for now, we use something known as Snowpack as a bundler instead of Create React app because it's a bit faster. If you're running it in a Create React app locally, then you have to follow it a bit differently. If you're running it on Next.js, there's a little bit of different procedure and so on. So if you go to Tailwind CSS installation section under docs path, you're going to see you have multiple options. We have been doing so far with the play CDN, which is not optimal for production and fine for just, having a little bit of experimentation. What you want is go into this frameworks guide and pick up whatever framework you are using. In this case, we are using React, not on server side, but on client side, and that also with Snowpack. So I'm just going to follow this quick Snowpack guide, which in essence is pretty much similar to what your Create React app guide would be. So I'm going to fire up a second terminal and start writing these commands. If you want to follow along, you can do the same thing in the codedamn playground, at least if we are still using the Snowpack bundler. You can see that we are using Snowpack because of the Snowpack keyword. So I'm going to install this. The next thing which we need from the Snowpack bundler is the configuration part. So we can do something like yarn tailwind init, I believe. And you can see it has created a Tailwind config for us, but not a Snowpack, not a post CSS config.js. So let's go ahead and create that ourselves, post CSS config.js. And over here in this file, I'm just going to keep it like this. And in the Tailwind config, we have to specify the content part. This is a little bit older configuration, Tailwind version 2. In Tailwind version 3, you just have to specify the content part of all you want to have. So let me just go ahead and copy that instead. So right here, we need, what we want to say is that look inside the src folder And anything you find with JS or JSX, just try to extract out Tailwind styles from that and apply that, right? That's what we are saying. And yep, that is pretty much it in this setup. And finally, it says us in the Snowpack configuration, we have to add this as the dev options. So let's go to Snowpack, and over here you can see inside dev options we have to add this Tailwind config, and inside the plugins we have to add the Snowpack plugin over here. There we go. Finally, we have to go to the public global.css in this case, and if that is not a file, then we'll create that global.css, import the Tailwind utilities, which are the base utilities, and then finally add this as a global CSS file inside our index.html. Okay, once we have done all of this, hopefully when we restart our server for Snowpack, it should pick up our Tailwind. So for this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say inside src folder, I'm going to remove all the CSS files, right? Including this global.css. I'm going to just close this. And inside app, I'm going to remove this, refresh this. Even inside index.js, let's remove this file and refresh this. And for global.css, it says us not found. There we go. Okay, so now you can see that global.css is pretty much empty at the moment. So looks like it did not propagate the changes. So let's just go ahead and copy these utilities one more time to see if it is not being overwritten. And okay, now if I go back to app.jsx, remove this app class and try to write bggray of 800. Okay, so did a quick change in the setup, move the global.css file in the src folder, and this index file now includes the global file. So now what we can do is do all sorts of Tailwind CSS stuff, which we did back in the HTML and CSS tutorials, and whatever we do, it will automatically start reflecting it in our React playground. So yep, that's pretty much it. That's how you would set up your Tailwind CSS thing in a React based playground. And the fun part of this is you don't have to reload, so that's awesome, but it will automatically minify and take out all the things, all the required things from your React JSX files, thanks to the configure the content property which you have specified over here. Hey everyone, welcome back, and in this video let's just quickly discuss about dark mode configuration option in Tailwind and what does that do. So in tailwind.config.js you would see that there is nothing over here, but what you can do is add an option known as dark mode of class. So the moment you do this, what's gonna happen is that now wherever you specify dark mode styles in Tailwind, you can make them toggle just with a click of a button. And let me show you how that is done. We have this page over here which has a couple of dark mode classes. You can see I have a dark selector and then I'm specifying a background, and I have a dark selector and I'm specifying a text color. By default, if I did not have this dark mode class, it would automatically show me dark mode. Why? Because my system is in dark mode. So what Tailwind does is that it prefers the scheme of the system. So if I did not have this class dark mode over here, and if I just wrote these couple of styles and just started my server, I would have the dark background over here. But because I wrote class, then that means whenever I add a dark class at the top of all of these where the dark class is applied, dark selector is applied, then only it gets triggered, right? If I remove that, it goes away. So in order to create a simple toggle button, all you have to do is import a use state. From here you can say x set x for a lack of a better word, I cannot think right now. And you can say that if X is true, then dark, otherwise no class. And by default, you can see we start with a false. And I can say on click on this div itself, I just toggle the X, right? So whenever I click on this div, you can see it turns from light mode to dark mode and vice versa. And the fun part about this is you can pretty much apply any sort of styles. So you can say p class dark text to Excel, and this will just start working automatically. So just give it a second for the styles to propagate and make sure you have the correct name over here as the attribute name. And as you can see, when I click on this now, it increases the font size. So you can pretty much customize your website as you like in the dark mode. And whenever you toggle it on a click of a button, it'll operate just fine. So yep, that's pretty much it for this video. Hopefully you were able to learn something new, something interesting about dark mode in this one. That is all for this one, and I'm gonna see you in the next video really soon.
If you're still watching this video, make sure you comment down in the comment section, I watched this video till the end. Also, if you're not part of CodeDamm's Discord community, you're missing out a lot on events which we organize on a weekly basis to code. You already know the drill. Make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and thank you so much for watching.